Here is a number that should completely stop you in your tracks. According to Canada's Food Price Report for 2026 published by the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University, a completely average Canadian family of four is now spending $17,571.79 every single year just to feed themselves. That number is climbing by nearly $1,000 per year, which means that if you are a middle-income household in this country right now, you are spending more on groceries alone than most Canadians paid for their entire rent 20 years ago. That is not a recession statistic, and that is not a warning from some fringe economist. That is the officially projected annual food bill for a normal family living a normal life in a country that was once considered one of the most livable on Earth. The reason that number matters so deeply is not just because it is large, but because of what it tells us about everything that surrounds it. The family earning that grocery bill is simultaneously carrying a housing cost that has doubled in a decade, along with a utility bill that keeps climbing every winter. They are also paying a carbon tax that the federal government has spent years insisting is revenue neutral, even as regular Canadians watch their bank accounts drain to zero every single month. The enemy in this story is not one single policy or one single corporation, and anyone who tells you it is that simple is selling you something. The real enemy is a system that has been layered on top of itself for decades. Stagnant wages and compounding costs and policy failures have combined to create a financial reality that is mathematically unsustainable for the people in the middle. This means the people who are not poor enough to qualify for social assistance, and not wealthy enough to insulate themselves from price increases, are taking the hardest hit. This means the people who are not poor enough to qualify for social assistance, and not wealthy enough to insulate themselves from price increases, are taking the hardest hit. These working Canadians are now the invisible casualties of a cost of living collapse that the political class has been extraordinarily slow to acknowledge. So let us go through the numbers carefully, and let us be honest about what they actually mean. Let us start with food banks, because that is where the human story is most visible and most painful. The Daily Bread Food Bank, which is the largest food bank network serving Toronto, reported that the city saw 3.49 million client visits in the fiscal year spanning 2024 and 2025. That figure represents a 273% increase above pre-pandemic levels, meaning that demand did not just double, but it nearly quadrupled compared to what food banks were managing before 2020. 1 in every 10 residents of Toronto now relies on a food bank at some point during the year. According to reporting from BNN Bloomberg citing Food Banks Canada, 23% of the people walking through those doors are children. This is a figure that should sit uncomfortably with every policymaker in this country, because it means that the fastest growing population of food bank users in Canada's largest city is people who had absolutely no role in the decisions that created this crisis. Food Banks Canada's chief executive Kirsten Beardsley told reporters that Canada is facing a food insecurity crisis at a scale the country has never seen before, with demand now running at roughly twice the level it was in 2019. She was clear that the problem is not primarily one of unemployment, but rather of underemployment, and of costs that have simply outpaced the capacity of working families to keep up. This means the food bank is no longer a safety net for people who have fallen completely out of the workforce, but is increasingly a supplement for people who are working full-time and still cannot make their numbers work at the end of the month. Now here is the part that makes this even darker, because the food bank numbers are the visible symptom, and the grocery store receipts are the actual disease. Canada's Food Price Report for 2026 is the most authoritative annual forecast on food costs in this country, and it is produced by researchers at Dalhousie University, the University of Guelph, the University of Saskatchewan, and the University of British Columbia. This report projects that the average Canadian family of four will spend $17,571.79 on food in 2026. This represents an increase of up to $994.63 compared to what that same family spent in 2025. But the number that really tells the full story of how completely the grocery situation has gotten away from ordinary Canadians is this one. Food prices in Canada are now 27% higher than they were 5 years ago, and the wages that are supposed to absorb that increase have not come close to matching it. Every single trip to the grocery store is a reminder that the purchasing power of a Canadian paycheck has been silently and systematically eroded. This erosion is driven by a combination of supply chain disruption, corporate pricing strategy, and currency pressure that no one in government has adequately addressed. Think about what 27% actually means in a household budget. If you were spending $12,000 a year on groceries in 2021, which was itself already a significant line item, you are now spending more than $15,000 for the exact same basket of food. The pay raise that was supposed to cover that gap was likely somewhere between 2 and 4% per year, meaning the math has been working against working Canadians every single month for half a decade. This is where the story shifts from grocery prices to something even more systemic, because the grocery bill does not exist in isolation. It sits inside a household budget that has been getting squeezed from every single direction simultaneously, and the data from Statistics Canada makes that compression visible in a way that is genuinely alarming. Research drawing on Statistics Canada household finance data shows that the middle 60% of Canadian households are now saving less than 5% of their income. Their debt service ratio, meaning the share of their gross income that goes directly to paying interest and principal on the money they owe, sits at 14.4%. Economists will tell you this represents a level of financial fragility that leaves virtually no room for any unexpected expense. A car repair, a dental bill, or a furnace replacement would have been a manageable inconvenience for a middle-income family 20 years ago, but it is now a financial crisis because the buffer is simply gone. The savings rate for the middle class has been essentially destroyed by the combination of stagnant income growth and compounding cost increases. The debt service ratio tells you that a significant portion of what these families do earn is already spoken for before they even think about groceries or rent or heating their homes. Now run the actual math on a family earning $100,000 a year, because that income level is often treated in political discourse as comfortable, or even as upper middle class. The reality of what that money actually buys in a major Canadian city in 2026 is something that every politician who has used that framing should be required to confront publicly. After federal and provincial income taxes, CPP contributions, and EI premiums, a household earning $100,000 in Ontario takes home somewhere in the range of $72,000 to $75,000 annually. The actual spending power before a single bill is paid is already $25,000 less than the headline number that sounds so reassuring when cited in a parliamentary debate. Take out the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Toronto, which according to data tracked by rentals.ca and consistently reported by major Canadian news outlets has been running above $3,000 per month in 2026 for anything in a reasonable neighborhood. You have already consumed $36,000 of that $73,000 take-home income just to keep a roof over your family's head. Add the $17,500 grocery bill from the 2026 food price report, and you are already at $53,500 spent before you have paid a single utility bill. This leaves out gas, childcare, internet, or any contribution to a retirement account. The remaining $20,000 has to cover all of those things, and when you lay it out that cleanly, the conclusion is not that this family is struggling financially. The conclusion is that this family is mathematically broke by design, because the system of costs they are navigating was not built for the wages that exist in this economy. Utility costs and the carbon tax add another layer to this compression that is worth examining carefully, because it is a category where political debate has generated enormous heat while the actual financial impact on households has sometimes been obscured. Natural gas bills, electricity rates, and home heating costs have all increased substantially across most Canadian provinces in recent years. This is driven by a combination of infrastructure costs, rate adjustments by provincial utilities, and the federal carbon pricing system that has added a per litre and per cubic metre cost to fossil fuel consumption. The federal government has consistently argued that the carbon tax rebate system returns more money to most households than the tax costs them. Independent analysis from the Parliamentary Budget Office has found that this is broadly true for lower-income Canadians, but the experience for middle-income families is considerably more complicated. The rebate structure does not fully account for the indirect cost increases that flow through everything from groceries to manufactured goods to transportation as carbon pricing ripples through the supply chain. What middle-income Canadians are experiencing is not just the direct carbon tax on their home heating fuel, but rather the embedded carbon cost in every product they buy that has been passed through by producers and retailers. The combination of direct and indirect costs has contributed meaningfully to the household budget compression that the Statistics Canada data is now measuring. The point is not that carbon pricing is wrong as a policy direction, but rather that implementing it on top of already strained household finances without adequate compensating income support has accelerated the financial deterioration that this video is documenting. The human voices behind these numbers are not hard to find, and they tell the story with a clarity that statistics alone cannot match. On Reddit's Personal Finance Canada forum, which has become one of the most honest and unfiltered places for financial conversation among ordinary Canadians, the recurring theme throughout 2026 has been working adults who describe doing everything they were told to do and still feeling like they are falling behind every single month. Posts describe people with university degrees and full-time professional jobs in major Canadian cities who are watching their savings accounts move toward zero. This happens not because of any financial irresponsibility, but simply because the cost of keeping a household running has exceeded what a single income or even a dual income can reliably cover. The sentiment that appears over and over in these threads is not despair, but rather a kind of exhausted and incredulous fury. It is a feeling that the contract between effort and reward that a generation of Canadians was raised to believe in has been quietly cancelled, and that no one in a position of power is willing to say so plainly. But before we get to what happens next, the data points to something even more sobering about where this trajectory is heading over the next 2 to 3 years. There are 3 ways this plays out from where we are standing right now in mid-2026, and they range from mildly encouraging to genuinely catastrophic. The honest assessment based on available data is that the middle option is by far the most likely. The best-case scenario goes something like this. A federal government that is either newly elected or dramatically reformed decides to treat the cost of living crisis as a genuine national emergency rather than a communications challenge. They implement a serious package of measures including meaningful rent control coordination with provinces, along with substantial and targeted income support that actually matches the scale of food cost increases for the bottom half of the income distribution. They also initiate an accelerated review of zoning laws to allow dramatically more housing supply in major urban centers, and a recalibration of carbon pricing to ensure that the middle-income quintiles are not bearing a disproportionate indirect cost burden. In this scenario, the food bank utilization numbers begin to plateau and then slowly decline over a 2 to 3 year period. The grocery inflation rate moderates as supply chains normalize and competitive pressure returns to the retail sector, and the savings rate for middle-income households begins to recover as the gap between income growth and cost growth narrows. The reason this scenario is unlikely, and it is worth being direct about this, is that it requires a level of policy coordination and political will that Canadian governments of every stripe have consistently failed to demonstrate in the face of this specific set of pressures. The structural incentives in Canadian housing policy in particular have not fundamentally changed, because the political class is disproportionately composed of homeowners and home price appreciation has been treated as economic success rather than economic failure. The realistic case scenario, which is where the data actually points, looks like this. The food insecurity numbers in Toronto and other major Canadian cities continue to climb through 2027, though the rate of increase slows somewhat as emergency food programs expand and certain categories of grocery inflation moderate following the agricultural disruptions of 2025. The middle class continues to shrink in the technical sense, meaning that the share of Canadians whose income puts them in the middle quintile continues to face real declines in purchasing power even as their nominal incomes grow. This is because the cost escalation in housing and food is outpacing wage growth by a margin that is not closing at any politically achievable pace. The debt service ratios that Statistics Canada is tracking continue to rise as interest rates remain elevated relative to historical norms and as the stock of consumer and mortgage debt continues to compound. This means that the 14.4% figure that is already alarming gets worse rather than better over the next 2 years. Net interprovincial and international migration patterns continue to reflect the affordability reality, with young workers and families with mobility options continuing to leave high-cost urban centers for smaller cities or for other countries entirely. This accelerates a demographic and economic hollowing out of the very tax base that the housing and social service infrastructure of those cities depends on. In short, things do not dramatically collapse, but the slow erosion of middle-class financial stability continues on a trajectory that will be very difficult to reverse without the kind of intervention described in the best case, and the political window for that intervention keeps narrowing. The worst-case scenario is the one that serious economists are increasingly willing to discuss even if policymakers are not, and it begins with a credit event rather than a gradual slide. The household debt service ratio that Statistics Canada measures at 14.4% for the middle-income quintile is an average, meaning there is a significant population of households whose ratio is substantially higher than that. Those households are the ones most exposed to any upward movement in interest rates or any downward shock to income. If a combination of economic slowdown, layoffs in rate-sensitive sectors, and continued cost pressure on groceries and housing converges in the same 12-month window, the number of Canadian households that move from financially stressed to technically insolvent could increase sharply and quickly. This is the scenario that mortgage lenders, credit unions, and the Bank of Canada's own Financial Stability Division have been quietly stress testing. In that scenario, food bank demand, which is already at nearly 3 times the pre-pandemic baseline, would surge further. The housing market in major cities would face a correction that would hurt both owners trying to sell and renters whose landlords are suddenly underwater. The political stability of a country that has increasingly stratified itself into those who own property and those who do not would face pressures that go well beyond economic policy debate. This is not a prediction, but it is a description of what the data makes possible if the wrong combination of variables lines up, and the fact that it is possible is itself a reason to take the current situation with considerably more seriousness than it has received. If you are a renter in Toronto, Vancouver, or any other major Canadian city right now, the honest advice based on this data is that your negotiating position in this economy is not going to improve meaningfully in the near term. Waiting for conditions to normalize before making decisions about your financial life is likely to cost you more than acting on the reality you are facing. That means if you have been considering moving to a smaller market where the rent-to-income ratio is less punishing, the math increasingly supports doing that sooner rather than waiting for the big city to become affordable again. The mechanisms that would make it affordable again are not operating at the speed or scale needed to change your monthly budget in a timeframe that matters. It also means that if you are a renter who is putting a significant share of your monthly income toward rent and finding that your savings rate is near zero, you are not managing your money wrong. You are experiencing the mathematical reality that Statistics Canada's data has confirmed at the national level, and the solution is not individual financial discipline but structural change that you alone cannot produce. If you are a homeowner facing mortgage renewal in the next 12 to 18 months, the data environment you are entering is one where the gap between your current locked-in rate and the renewal rate you will be offered could represent a meaningful monthly cost increase. The time to model that impact on your household budget is now rather than at the moment the renewal arrives. The families who are in the most exposed position are those who purchase near the peak of the market with high loan-to-value ratios, and who are simultaneously facing the grocery inflation and utility cost increases described throughout this video. Their equity cushion may be thinner than they realize, and their cash flow margin is likely already compromised. Getting a full picture of your renewal exposure, your remaining equity, and your monthly spending reality before you sit down with a lender is not paranoid financial planning, but rather the minimum level of preparation that the current environment requires. If you are an investor looking at residential real estate in Ontario or British Columbia right now, the data suggests that the assumption of perpetual appreciation that has underpinned Canadian residential property as an investment thesis for the last 2 decades is under more serious strain than the headline price indices might suggest. Markets that look stable at the median can be hiding significant stress in specific segments, and the demographic and affordability trends described in this video are pointing toward a structural moderation of demand rather than the kind of temporary correction that recovers fully within a cycle. That does not mean residential real estate in Canada is a category to abandon, but it does mean that any investment thesis that depends on the kind of appreciation rate seen between 2015 and 2022 is making an assumption that the current data does not support. The risk-adjusted return calculation for residential property looks considerably less attractive when you account for the possibility that the tenant base is simultaneously more financially stressed and more politically mobilized around rent control and tenancy protection than it has been in a generation. If you are a young adult in Canada right now, in your 20s or early 30s, who is looking at the numbers being described in this video and asking yourself whether the standard life script of stable career, owned home, and comfortable retirement is actually achievable in this country on a realistic income, the data does not give you an easy answer, but it does give you an honest one. The cost structure of major Canadian cities has moved substantially beyond what a single professional income, and in many cases even a dual professional income, can sustain at the standard of living that previous generations associated with a middle-class life. That does not mean the country is broken beyond repair, and it does mean your options are as limited as the grocery receipt makes them feel, but it does mean that the planning assumptions that worked for the generation ahead of you need to be revisited honestly rather than deferred in the hope that the situation resolves itself. The people who are navigating this environment most effectively are the ones who are making deliberate choices about location, lifestyle costs, and financial structure based on the reality that exists rather than the one that was promised. You can find every source and official report I used in this documentary linked in the description below so you can dig into the data yourself. I am genuinely interested in hearing how these economic conditions are affecting your personal finances, so please share your thoughts or your own experience in the comments section below. Subscribe if you want to stay updated on the real state of the Canadian economy, and I look forward to seeing you in the next breakdown.